Measuring twice and cutting once is the old kind of, colloquial saying of like how to build things, right? Like you want to make sure that you're going to have a plan before you actually start investing time and money into some kind of project. And I don't know how to build a house or like a dog house or a bird house or any kind of house, but I assume that you would make maybe some kind of plan that might resemble something like this. But what I do know is how to, build the kind of plan, how to build the data model, as we call it, for an application, and that's what we're going to talk about, all right? So data model sounds like a weird technical term. Don't worry about it. All it means is like a blueprint, essentially, okay? That's all we're doing. And there's a few reasons why we definitely want to do this. For one, it's going to help you determine your app's scope. And what do we mean by that? We mean, what is this thing going to do? What processes is it going to improve, and who in our organization or our business is going to be affected by this? Who is going to be using the app? How is this essentially going to work, all right? So that model is essentially just the first thing of figuring out, what are we really doing here? And it helps us kind of get that down on paper. Once we have that on paper, we can be sure that, again, that kind of measure twice, cut once kind of thing comes into play here. It's going to shorten development time. It's going to make this a less expensive thing to do. Why? Because we already have a plan in place and we know what we need to do before we start, banging our heads against the proverbial creator wall, right? Third, it's going to help us make a more efficient app, right? So if we can write this all out and draw this all up and actually visualize what we're doing, we can all of a sudden spot, you know what, that might not be the best way to do it. Maybe if we tried this would actually be a better application, right? In information technology, we're always trying to find efficient ways to use information because it means things will run faster. That's why computers generally run faster. They're made more powerful to be able to process things better. So the better our app is built, the better structure it has, the better it handles data, the more effective it's going to be. There's a second point to this, though, also, is that it helps reduce data entry, right? And it's not just from a organizational perspective of our employee is spending 4 hours doing data entry where we'd rather have her doing something else. That's one part of it, but also the other part of it is that data entry is where things will usually start to go wrong, right? If you ever heard the phrase garbage in, garbage out, this is what we're talking about here, right? It doesn't matter how beautiful and perfect a system is, but if you put in bad information into your perfect system, the system will be completely irrelevant and it'll just be a crappy thing, okay? So by reducing data entry, you're actually eliminating human error. You're able to put it in one time into the system and then use it in multiple places and, so you save on the organizational side of things, but then you're also saving on simply essential security that's kind of built into making sure this works. So when you guys are kind of soft, I'm like, okay, well, maybe it kind of makes sense. But when you hear a really emphatic yes, it's like, all right, cool. The last thing here, when we're modeling our apps, is it's going to give us a blueprint and a roadmap, okay? And, I separated those two terms out because, they kind of function in slightly different ways. So in the sense that we have a blueprint, we can see now and going forward what we're going to do or how this thing works, right? So in the example of a house, if you needed to figure out, well, can we knock out this beam? You might want to consult the blueprint to see, oh no, if we knock out the beam, the house will fall down, right? You don't want to do that. So personnel and organizations change, processes change. Maybe you're the person who builds this app, but then you kind of, delegate that to someone else later. By having a nice blueprint, the new owner of the project can see for certain or for sure how this thing is supposed to work and how it does work. It keeps kind of everyone on the same page. But then more importantly, as we are building our apps or are continuing to build our apps, as we continue to develop our apps, notice the word develop there, it gives us a frame of reference and a roadmap for the next stuff that we need to do, okay? So again, the word application development, usually it's an ongoing process, right? I mean, Creator itself always is getting new features, is always getting new things added to it. We always know, we can probably say a couple years ahead of time all the stuff that we want to do, but then it comes down to prioritizing and knocking it out step by step and pushing out those features. In the same way, if you have a simple application, but we're actually going to want to add something to it over the next 6 months or in the next year, you'll want to have that roadmap in place so you can just kind of manage your project better. So as we're going to build our data model, we're essentially going to need to ask ourselves 3 questions as we do this. This is going to kind of help us kind of pull out the information out of our organization so that way we can build an app that will be successful for us. So the first thing we need to ask is, what process are we trying to improve? Okay, so if we keep breaking down specifically what we want to do, we might find that there's actually many processes that are interdependent, or there's like one process in particular that's really the drawback, the real problem of this whole thing. And if we can figure out and identify that, we know for certain that that's what we need to fix. And if we can do that, obviously things will get much better. So it's important to really think about, what process do we want to fix? And if we come up with 4, 5, 6, 12, 20 different processes that we want to do, well, then we need to kind of figure out, well, which one do we want to work on first? Which is the highest priority? Which one will give us the most value? And again, that goes back to having a blueprint and a roadmap in place so you can, do this over time, right? It's not, even if you built like a big, crazy, perfect application, or you buy a big, crazy, perfect application, you don't want to just throw that at all your employees. Because if they don't know how to use it, the system's going to fail and they won't be happy, and you'll have a mutiny and you'll waste money and you'll be caught in a contract and the world will end. So you don't want that to happen, right? So even if you have a perfect system, you then are still going to want to, push it out into stages. And again, thinking about process is going to be a big help to that. So second question, which people or groups are involved in this process? So say we have a specific process in mind that we want to fix. Well, we need to think about, who is actually a part of it. Who, it could be one person, it could be a group of people. We need to kind of identify who these key people are in the process that really make up the process. And once we know that, we can then look a little closer and actually talk to these people and figure out question number 3, which is, what are the distinct problems or pain points that these distinct groups of people or individuals are experiencing, right? You might find, for example, that in a situation where you have maybe someone that does a lot of data entry. As a manager, you're thinking, man, I'd really like to be able to, pull Adriana off that, and I'd really like her to be doing something else because she's way smarter than this, she's way more valuable, and this is just a massive waste of time, right? But then, of course, Adriana might very well say, well, in my job, I have all of these crazy moments where everything can go wrong because the system is so erratic, right? Because there's, just me constantly putting in different things, constantly looking at different spreadsheets. I know that this is something I was talking about earlier at breakfast, which is this whole problem of I might have to copy a record and make sure I've copied the right one. I mean, any number of big data entry problems can occur. And if we're not familiar with all of those data entry related pain points or problems that our employees actually juggling and dealing with and managing to keep under control, well, if we put some application in place that doesn't really address that, we haven't really solved the problem exactly, or we've only solved a piece of it, and maybe whatever assumption we've made about how this was working in the first place is just not quite right, which leads us to some answer that's not quite right, which again is a big waste of time, right? If you're going to spend the time building a custom app, you want to make sure it's addressing all of the different problems, and that way you're getting a really good custom solution. So, specifically, what are the processes? Who are the people? Who are the groups? And what are the pain points that those people or groups are experiencing in our current process? So now what I'm going to do is kind of shift into an example. Karen operates a cooking school. It's a small business essentially where she has a few people that work for her. She does classes of 20 to 30 people, and she tries to schedule them as often as she can. These are kind of one-time a deal classes. And so for her, she keeps a spreadsheet with all of her lessons in it. So the lesson schedule is just in a spreadsheet. She has a simple website where she posts a static lesson schedule, right? So that means that she has to keep going back and updating it whenever there's a change. It doesn't just dynamically change, all right? Students go on the website, they see the schedule, and then they have to call her to book space. And of course, when they call, they might catch the machine, they might catch Karen, and Karen then has to write all their information down and, schedule them appropriately. She then puts that into a different spreadsheet, which is the registration spreadsheet, shares that with her instructors. And, let's give Karen at least the benefit of the doubt. Like maybe she's using like Zoho Sheet, and then she has to manually call or email instructors to remind them about when they're working and what they're doing and what ingredients they need to buy and all sorts of stuff like that. But then since students actually pay on the first day of class, she also has to do reminder calls to the students to make sure they show up so she can even get paid. So this is kind of this crazy manual process she does. And then lastly, she collects physical feedback forms from the instructors who distribute those to the students and collect those and bring them back to make sure that the quality of the class and the quality of the instruction is good. And obviously, we can imagine how that goes. You have like 15 pieces of paper, every class that you have to deal with. So this is kind of the problems that are operating in Karen's cooking school. Does this sound relatable problems? Do these sound like they, kind of hit home a little bit? I'll be gentle. Okay. When we talked about this kind of first thing of these 3 questions that we need to do, we can kind of identify with Karen kind of what's going on. So what are the processes that we've kind of listed? Well, we've actually found 5 or 6 different processes that Karen could actually improve. She could improve online enrollment, lesson scheduling, schedule distribution, notifying instructors and students of various things, and tracking student feedback. Right? So those are all distinct processes that we've kind of discovered in Karen's organization that we need to fix. Who are the people in the groups? Well, they tend to always kind of be 3 different types of people, which is Karen herself as the business owner or manager, the students or her customers, and the instructors or her employees. So these are the kind of the distinct people or groups that always kind of have a different take on a particular problem. So what are the pain points here? So she talks to these, the people in her organization. She looks at this more carefully. Well, with registration, the registration is actually really slow for students, right? They go on the website, they see a schedule, they know what they want to do, but then they have to make a phone call. Sometimes the phone call doesn't get answered. Then Karen has to call them back. If they call at the last minute, they might actually miss out on the class itself, which is, missing out on revenue. So it's a really crappy, actually, enrollment process that's costing time, costing money, and it's just not a really good customer experience, right? And then obviously it's very tedious for Karen. That might be the first thing that Karen would know. But again, thinking about the students helps us kind of figure out what is the complete problem here, who are the different groups that are really being affected by this, and what are the ways they are being affected. Second thing, it is tough to share the schedule, right? It's tough to share the schedule online. It's tough to share the schedule to employees. If things change, they might not all be updated in the same places, right? Which means now you have communication issues between every key person in this organization. Instructors might not know what they're doing, Karen might not know if she's told them, and students may not know what's going on either, right? So that's a huge problem if you have a process that all 3 group or everyone involved might not ever really, know what's going on. And then lastly, third, notifying instructors and students drains Karen's time. This is just too much manual work. And again, people drop the ball. She might forget to do something. It's all just something she has to keep in her head, which again is really tough. And if she ever wants to expand and hire someone that does this kind of administrative work, well, she's now got to train them because there's not actually any process in place for doing this. And you'll have to create some, actual frameworks. And last, paper feedback. If we deal with paperwork, we always kind of know how that goes. Feedback gets lost. It's hard to file things. And when you have all these things on paper, if you actually want to collate any of this data, you'll have to do a bunch of data entry. Again, data entry can go wrong, which means the results you're actually getting could end up just being wrong. So all the data entry that you've done could be for nothing potentially. There's a lot of problems where this could go wrong, right? Also, like what if you have an instructor who just doesn't always give, the worst reviews that they get, right? What if they always just kind of lose them? That's something that's really common that might happen. So this is another problem where Karen really doesn't know exactly for sure what's going on in her classrooms because she can't always be there, right? So these are the kind of pain points that we're going to need to address in our application. And again, this is a very kind of general scope. I mean, we've broken down processes, we've broken down stakeholders, and we've broken down key pain points. We have a much better idea of what's going on. Now we need to start figuring out what we're going to do about these individual pain points, these individual issues. So what we're going to do is do some problem statements, and these will help us find manageable solutions to problems. Now, it's important to remember that one pain point equals one problem statement, okay? We don't want to like create these super complex problem statements because it actually doesn't help us distill what the problem is and what we can do to fix it. So kind of a framework that we can use for writing problem statements is something like this. So we're going to create blank for blank to blank, right? So we're going to create something for someone, essentially, to do something, okay? So putting this into Karen's example, we're going to create a centralized schedule of classes, right? Something that if we update in one place, updates everywhere else. So that way we always make sure that we're having the right communication. Since Karen is the person who maintains the schedule, this is going to be something that is built for her use, right? And again, it's going to easily update the website and share the schedule with the instructors. It's going to be able to affect it's going to affect the different groups of people that she is trying to, work for, essentially. Okay, so another example. So we're going to create a notification system for Karen to update and use to send out messages. And this is going to confirm and remind instructors and students about lessons and schedule changes and such, right? So this communication system that can be used to talk to two different groups of people, okay, by Karen. So since this is a workshop, we're going to actually take a couple minutes so that way you can, try to write some of your own statements if you actually have a process that you are thinking of improving, or you have an app that you're trying to make better, or whatever. I mean, I'd encourage you just to, to give this a try. If you don't have an app in mind, you can use one of the Karen examples, or you can try to think of some other Karen problems you might have. You can also think of like recruitment. Think of it being like we need a better way to accept job applications or manage an interview process or something like that. So I'm just kind of throwing out some really generalized ideas here. If you have something in mind or you want to try it, you can go ahead and try it. Yeah.
At the end of our engagements, our engineers always have to complete a trip report, which is a Word doc. They send it to me. It gets maybe archived, but the information on it isn't searchable. It isn't given to anyone. So if there was any really follow-up items, it gets lost. And, there could be details that could go back to our sales team. So I'm thinking of either a form or a survey that they could complete at the end of an engagement that just automatically archives that information into the system and sends it to the appropriate people.
Yeah, that sounds good. Anyone else have something? Well, you can use the form as a survey, right? So a form is just a way of collecting data. A survey is just a specific type of form, right? So once we know that we can build a form, we can make it do whatever we want. And if we know how to build logic into the form, like make it respond in different ways, we can then actually have conditional fields that show up to ask specific questions in certain situations. So we can get into all sorts of crazy features, but this is kind of a more macroscopic general look at concrete problems. But that's a great example, though, right, of something specific that we know is not going right, having a specific idea of how we can fix it, okay? And again, even if you don't end up building this, or you find, oh, this is too challenging, or this is taking too much time, and we need to hire someone, if you have things like this written down, this will go a lot faster for your developer. They'll go, oh, super, I totally get this. Like you're helping them, know what the problem is. It's like when you can go into your mechanic and tell them, I know this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, just do it, thank you, and it really helps out, right? So this is good. So I'm just going to move on. So this has been the kind of preliminary stuff that you need to do to collect different information and to lay it out for yourself. Now we're going to actually put it into a data model. Now, the next slide might scare a couple people, but please just hang in there, all right? So this is an entity relationship diagram. It's not too faint or too gray. So this is an entity relationship diagram for an application that is, for some kind of hiring process, okay? Now, I actually didn't put this into this presentation. So the way that I know that is just by looking at what is actually on this diagram, okay? So we have three big boxes with little rectangles within each of them, right? And the first one at the top says interviewers, right? So this is some kind of thing that has to do with interviewers. And in the little boxes below it, it says role, email, name, and employee ID. So we can assume that this is probably information that we want to associate to interviewers. Next, we have another one going clockwise, interviews. Interesting. So date, notes, status, interviewers, and there's a line that we see connecting interviewers to interviewers that's actually written in the little box, and then applicant. And similarly, from applicant, we see another little line that zigs out to another box called applicants, where we have other information that's being collected, address, email, resume, name, phone number, okay? So what this is doing is it lays out how this application is working, what are the different types of information that's being collected, and where is the information that we're collecting being used in other places, okay? Is there relationships between these different entities, okay? So we'll go into this a little more in depth. We'll start with the box itself, the big box. In database design language, this is called an entity, okay? And when we're building a data model, what we want to do is figure out what are all of the different entities that are going to be in our application, okay? This can be a person, an object, a task, right? As we saw, interviewers, applicants, interviews. Interviews themselves are an entity, so don't think that it has to be a person, okay? An entity is just, some kind of thing that we need to keep a record of, that we're needing to keep track of, okay? Now, a little trick to identifying entities within our process is looking for nouns in your problem statement, okay? Nouns are usually a good way to go about it. So, for example, in our Karen's Cooking School thing, we saw, we have Karen, we have instructors, we have students. These would all be entities, potentially, in Karen's cooking app, and we're going to look at this as we continue through the example. Now, in Creator, the term that is going to kind of be the substitute for entities is forms, okay? Forms are going to usually be the way that we do entities, because this is the way that we're actually going to be able to collect the data on these different categories or these different things, okay? We have interviewers, interviews, and applicants. Karen's app here, these are the entities that we will have for her application, okay? We'll have instructors, lessons, registrations, and feedback. So we have our entities here for our application, okay? Next comes adding our attributes, okay? Attributes are all of the little items that are contained in the larger box. Attributes are essentially any detail or a detail that you need to record about an entity, some kind of detail that's important to understand the entity, right? So, for example, like when you fill out a driver's license application, that's a form that you're given. What is the first attribute that they want to know when you're applying for a driver's license? What is your name? First, middle, last, right? These are key attributes to understand the identity of the driver's license applicant. And so in Creator, attributes are going to be fields, okay? And as we know in Creator, hopefully we know in Creator, there's a bunch of different fields that we can use, but fields are generally going to be your attributes, okay? So what does that look like in Karen's data model? Well, we have lessons, for example. So what's the name of the lesson, the title? What's the description of it? What is its start time? What is its end time? What is its duration? Of course, you see its duration is just going to be the difference between start and end time. What is its instructor? What is its capacity and how much does it cost, right? So this is all of the information that we would ever need to know about our lessons or about Karen's lessons. But if we look to the next box, we see instructors. We don't need as much information about our instructors. We need their first name, last name, their email, and their phone. We need to know who they are and how do we get in contact with them, okay? Now, there's different things that we could definitely add. For example, if we had... we paid our instructors differently. We could add an attribute in there as well to say, how much do we pay them or what is their hourly rate or whatever. So there's other information we can add, but to keep this simple, this is how it works. So next, the last thing, those arrows that we saw refer to relationships, okay? And a relationship is a way of connecting entities through shared attributes, okay? If we look at the second point, it's a little more clear, I hope, which is that it allows apps to reference data that's stored in other places. So in Creator, these are generally created with what we call lookup fields, right? So remember, connections, referencing, looking up, like a dictionary. We're going to go look up that information, right? So those three words are really important to understanding kind of how this works, okay? Connections, reference, relationship, lookup, okay? This is how this kind of works. So to show an example of a lookup, make in creator, to form a relationship, we can see that we have this entity, this form, that stores all of the information about the specific lessons that we're doing. Well, when we're going to do registrations, which is that online form we're going to have on our website so students can register, we're going to want to be able to say which lessons are we offering right now, or which lessons can you sign up for. Rather than recreate that in the registration, which means what? Data duplication, which is a no-no, we don't want that. We can simply have our registrations entity or form look up any information that is related to the lesson. And that could mean pulling in information about its title, about its start time, about its price, or anything, right? So you notice that we don't actually have to have this price, is that when we're talking about price on registrations, we're really talking about what is the total cost our cooking class, because we can actually pull the price of a specific lesson into that. Again, we can look at another example, right? Where we have lessons and we can list, who is going to be the instructor of this lesson, okay? And we can also see feedback, right? If a student fills out a feedback form, they select their instructor from it, or we can auto-populate that or whatever. But the point is that information that is stored in the instructor's entity or through the instructor's form, we can reference in multiple places, right? So that means we enter the data once and now we can use it wherever we need it, right? Which saves a lot of time, creates a lot of efficiency, and reduces data duplication. Because again, if we don't have that, that means that we have a spot where the instructor could be entered incorrectly into lessons and could also be entered incorrectly into feedback, right? So all we need to do is just make sure we did it once correctly, and then we'll be fine for the rest of our processes. This is pretty much the complete relationship kind of data model of our app to this point, okay? Maybe this looks a little complicated, but if we kind of just break it down by color, we can see, how this actually works, right? So in our registrations, we need to know what are the lessons that we have available. So we connect lessons and we can bring that into registrations there, right? In our feedback, we want to know who the student was that basically is giving us this feedback, right? Well, all of the student information is being collected right here in registrations, right? So this is actually something that might have surprised us, is that we actually, in this version of this app, we don't have a student's entity, okay? Because we're collecting all the information we need to know about our students in the registration. So the registration info is being pulled into the feedback entity or feedback form so we know who the student is, right? Instructors are being pulled into the feedback form from the instructor's entity, and lesson information is also being pulled back into the feedback form or feedback entity, okay? Basically, remember, it's that we're trying to identify what are the distinct things we need to collect records of. And then we're going to try to make sure that we're not going to collect records about the same things in multiple places. Well, the picture can also actually help us figure out what thing we need to build first in our application, okay? And so what's next is we're going to build entities that with the fewest dependencies first, okay? So, for example, if we look at this right now, we see that instructors, right, is feeding or pushing information into other entities, into other forms, but there's no information that's being pushed into instructors. So it would make sense that we should start with this, right? Because everything is dependent on this. This is not dependent on anything. So we put in who are our instructors. And in Creator, we can do that by uploading a spreadsheet. So Karen probably has a spreadsheet of her instructors. She uploads that. Now we have a form that can do that, right? Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to start working on our class schedule. Why? Because this only has one dependency, which is our instructors, right? So now that we have instructors in place, we now start building our class schedule, where we can say whatever date, whatever time, whatever class, with whatever description we want, and we will then be able to reference our instructor's entity or our instructor's form to create this instructor's attribute or this instructor's field. Moving counterclockwise, we see that registrations also, right now, only has one dependency also, right, which is lessons. Well, since you need to have instructors to be able to add instructors to lessons, well, you probably should do this third, since lessons is going to be the next thing you need to be able to add, right? So, and then lastly, there's 3 dependencies in this feedback form, right? And ultimately, you're going to need all these other things in place before you can even add these attributes if you want to have the most efficient thing. So does it make sense what I'm saying here about how we're going to move counterclockwise around this? Now, there's no proper way exactly to make the diagram itself, all right? The way that I recommend doing this is just sit with a piece of paper, write this out, and then make the lines and stuff, or do it like in a presentation tool or something like that. So we're going to do this together now. We're going to do another app. So we're going to make an app for a library. So far, I've identified 5 entities that we're going to want to keep track of. An entity that we would need to keep track of for an application that runs and manages the process of checking books in and out. So a patron or a person or a member, someone who is going to check the book out. The book will be assigned to that person. So it's not that crazy. So yeah, this is essentially it. Now, we name these people borrowers. That's fine. Now, the stumbling block is usually going to be checking in and checking out, because we might be thinking like, oh, well, who's the other person, right? So now attributes. So for this one, we have title, author name, year, genre, ISBN, description, and barcode. Now, barcode. This is something you can do in Creator, where you can actually generate barcodes and attach them to things so you can scan them in and out. Right? So this is actually a pretty good example. You could throw your own barcodes on these books if you wanted. You can use the standard ones, whatever, all right? And so this is kind of what the relationship diagram is going to look like when we kind of flesh this out. We notice that there's books, we have members, we have librarians, and then we have checking out and checking in. And of course, what's interesting about this is that there's these top row entities that are always being fed into the checkout and check-in process equally, right? I mean, if you're going to be able to check a book out, you need to also have that same information to check the book in, so we can look up all that information as well, right? And if we were going to think of, well, what's the best way to do this? Well, we could build books first and check all those things and log all that stuff. We could then do our member system, and then we could do our librarian system. And since all these, the check-in and check-out are the only ones with any dependencies, we would then do those last, all right? So thank you very much. It's been very nice.